Welcome to the 1515, a 15-minute podcast brought to you by the regulatory legal experts at the Maples Group. Here, you will learn more about the latest developments in the regulatory laws of the Cayman Islands on the 15th day of every month.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the new and hopefully improved 1515 regulatory podcast. My name is Chris Capewell. I'm partner and head of the regulatory and financial services team here at the Maples Group in the Cayman Islands. We've actually moved away from our regular format of the 1515 webcast, and we are now having a go at a podcast style of presentation with the aim of making the 1515 easier to listen to, easier to find, and hopefully more accessible in general. The prior 1515 webcasts are not going to be lost. They are still available on our website. If you have difficulties with that, then just contact any of today's presenters. Although we are moving away from a webcast style of presenting, the aim of the podcast is still very much to track you through Cayman Islands regulatory developments as they happen here in the islands in or around sort of 15 minutes duration, and we'll also be releasing them on or around the 15th of every month. With that background, and to help me with our first podcast, I'm joined by my fellow partners Tim Dawson and Patrick Head. Tim, Pat, you're both on and you're ready and excited for the new podcast?
Very excited, Chris.
Oh, you would. You too, Pat. Thank you. Today's topics that we're going to be covering are FATF plenary session, some letters that have been issued by CIMA regarding nature of business queries, more breach letters from the DITC relating to economic substance and the Common Reporting Standard. We'll have a look at mandatory disclosure rules for OECD and where they're at. And then finally, we'll just touch on some general sanctions matters. As always, please do note that the contents of our webcast and now podcast do not constitute legal advice. They should be taken as a general update only, reflecting the personal views of the presenters. Before we get going, there is a light housekeeping matter to cover. If you click on the media player in the links button below, you'll find the presentation slides and any resources that we're going to mention throughout today's podcast. So kicking off the first discussion of the podcast, let's have a look at FATF. Tim, I know this is an area that you're very involved with, so do you want to just give us a summary of where we're currently at with the FATF?
Yeah, sure. So as our listeners will no doubt recall, Cayman Islands is currently on the FATF's ongoing monitoring or grey list. Periodically, the FATF holds plenaries at which it assesses whether or not countries can be removed or indeed placed upon the list. The latest FATF plenary was held in Paris on the 20th to 24th of February. The Cayman Islands is still on the list, but there is recognition of the process which the country is making. And just to remind you where we are on that, the kind of scoring is split between technical compliance, which goes to how well the FATF's recommendations are implemented in the jurisdiction, and the country is 40 out of 40 on that front. And in addition to that, it's looking to complete 63 recommended actions dealing with effectiveness, which is to say the degree to which those same laws are actually effectively enforced. And at the moment, we have met, or as the jurisdiction has met, 62 out of 63. The final recommended action relates to the investigation and prosecution of all types of money laundering cases in line with the Cayman Islands risk profile. So what the FATF wants to see is that the Cayman Islands has a sufficiently sophisticated police and prosecutorial and judicial system to cope with complex cross-border cases. This, of course, includes many component parts, including the sentencing by our independent judiciary. So what happens is that prior to each plenary, the country will provide the FATF with an update. We're expecting an update to be presented in April, and we're in advance of the FATF's next plenary, which is being held in June 2023. So with a fair wind, hopefully we'll have met all of the recommended actions which the Cayman Islands is required to meet.
Okay, thanks, Tim. As you mentioned, sentencing is going to be one of the key parts to look at. I did see that Cayman Islands Ministry of Financial Services and Commerce did release a press release a couple of weeks ago on this, where they did state that Cayman Islands is pleased the FATF has duly noted our continuous progress towards completing a final recommended action regarding investigations and prosecutions of money laundering cases. So there's some positivity there. If we do move away from the FATF and then Pat, I know that we've seen some movement on CIMA, particularly regarding general queries on nature of business. Did you want to track through those, and then if you would also be able to just let listeners know what you're seeing on the DITC and if they're similarly being as proactive?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We have seen a bit of an uptick from CIMA just in the first couple of months of 2023, in particular in relation to the nature of business, where CIMA has begun auditing entities that are registered with the general registry that have classified their nature of business as either being an investment fund, regulated private fund, or as an investment fund, regulated mutual fund. Now, those are the sort of tick boxes that you can elect when choosing your nature of business. The YC we've been doing is checking those classifications against their own internal records of entities registered either under the PFA or the MFA with them as an investment fund, and is then gone about issuing letters to industries that are requesting details from various clients regarding affected entities where they have noted that, an entity is not, in fact, registered as a fund with CIMA and just wanting an explanation. We anticipate that in most cases the issue will have arisen as a result of an error in selecting the appropriate nature of business classification on the entity's annual return. It's also possible that entities had to make a sort of difficult choice in terms of selecting the criteria for their nature of business. In certain instances, entities will be an investment fund. There may be a single investor fund, but not necessarily registered with CIMA. And, in that case, sort of absent another appropriate box to select, we would sort of suggest selecting holding company, business other. Similarly, there's sort of not really a box to check if you fall within one of the private funds and non-fund arrangement exemptions either. So it's probably just an administrative point, but it's a relevant point that a lot of clients should check their nature of business classification. And, importantly, they shouldn't be holding themselves out as being a regulated investment fund if they're not.
But you mentioned that they do have a difficult choice to face. And I think we come across this fairly frequently when you do have a look at the definitions, particularly for investment fund vehicles across AML, beneficial ownership, FATCA, CRS, economic substance, now nature of business. They're all very similar, but they're not identical, right? The definitions, and sometimes where you do get a complex structure, it's hard to place it precisely within each definition. So as you said, it is sometimes a difficult choice for clients.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point, Chris. And I mean, a good example obviously being that, you may technically need to select holding company other for an entity within a wider investment fund structure that may otherwise classify as being an investment fund for economic substance purposes, for example. So, it's not always easy. And I think that if clients do have any doubt in that regard, they should certainly be reaching out to the Cayman advisor or to us.
So speak to your lawyers. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly if you've also received one of these letters from CIMA, again, reach out to us. Very happy to assist.
What about DITC, Pat? Are we seeing similar queries and questions from DITC?
We are. We're sort of seeing a bit of a running theme, continuation sort of what we were seeing towards the latter half of last year from the DITC, which is that they have been issuing letters to a number of entities, both under the economic substance framework and also under the common reporting standard framework, with respect to potential breach by various entities which for one reason or another may not have completed their economic substance notification and or may not have filed economic substance return. Similarly, under the CRS regime, may not have completed their annual filing obligations reporting, that is, last year in July. So listeners may remember that in March of 2022, the authority released guidelines explaining the requirements for persons that may be subject to compliance and enforcement actions under both the economic substance regime and also under the CRS regime. So that process normally starts with a receipt of a letter from the DITC, who normally would reach out to the designated responsible person or sort of principal point of contact for the relevant entity. In certain instances where the DITC has been unable to reach that contact, they have reached out to the registered office, and we're aware of clients receiving the letters, which obviously then set out a timeline for compliance. The letters under the enforcement regime, the authority is obviously obligated to set out the nature of the breach and propose remedial actions, and if a potential penalty will attach. So if clients and listeners have received those letters, they do need to take those quite seriously and to look at the remedial actions required and in particular the timeframes for remediation. Obviously, failure to meet the remedial requirements, I think the next step will obviously be a monetary penalty. Those are also not insignificant, more so under the CRS regime, where we have seen penalties up to $45,000.
Cool. Thanks, Pat. Yeah, and as you mentioned, some of the fines can be quite material. One point, I guess, whilst you're on the DITC, and we did mention this within the intro, is that there's potentially a new area coming into the Cayman Islands that might be keeping us and other advisors busy. And that's the mandatory disclosure rules for CRS avoidance arrangements and opaque offshore structures. Cayman Islands, as well as a good number of other signatories, did sign a multilateral agreement relating to CRS avoidance arrangements and opaque offshore structures a couple of months ago. I think it was in November of last year. And people may be familiar with this regime. The general purpose is to provide tax administrators globally with information on arrangements that, or at least they purport to, circumvent CRS, and then also that implement structures that aim to disguise beneficial owners of assets that are held offshore. The rules generally apply to intermediaries relating to arrangements, and intermediaries would cover, for example, promoters who are designing or marketing the arrangement, and it would also apply to service providers who are involved in the design, marketing, implementation of the structure. It will end up with a reporting obligation being placed on the intermediary. So watch this space on how that operates. No current regulations as yet in the Cayman Islands or indeed in any of the other jurisdictions, but this is going to probably be rolling out at some stage soonish. If you do have any questions, obviously feel free to connect with us. Tim, can I just bring you in? I know that this week in particular, in the last, you've been doing quite a lot of sanctions advice. Where are you placed on the license now? Is that still around specifically for fund structures and then more particularly the general license?
Yeah, okay. I mean, so just to break that down a bit, I mean, right now there is a general license in place to deal with sanctioned investment funds, but it only really comes into play where you have a fund which is owned or controlled or deemed to be owned or controlled by a designated person. And the effect of that is that the fund vehicle itself effectively becomes frozen, and that in turn means that minority investors are stuck. Service providers won't deal with them or can't deal with them, but for this license. Currently there is this general license allowing investment funds which are in this position to deal with shares and interests held by non-sanctioned investors and to pay fees and expenses for maintaining the fund as a going concern. But this license is due to expire on the 4th of April, so next month. Now, we know that there is an intention to extend this license. It's not entirely under the control of the Cayman authorities, though. So from what we understand, they are either looking to already have put steps in place to get an extension to this license, but ultimately that's going to be subject to receipt of the consent of the UK authorities. So I guess, again, it's going to watch this space, but from what we understand, the Cayman Financial Reporting Authority is taking proactive steps to try and get this license extended.
So yeah, if you have been relying on the general license, then pay close attention to that, I guess, is the message. Perfect. That concludes our very first podcast format. So thank you, everybody, for listening. Tim and Pat, as always, thank you very much for taking the 15 minutes or so to chat through some of these issues. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, Tim, or Patrick. Thank you very much for listening, and we will be releasing our next podcast on around the 15th of next month. Thank you.